Hello, everyone. My name is Luisa Reyes from Responsible Innovation Labs. Now our panel of early stage founders is going to talk about navigating real life scenarios. Take it away, Lyle.
Thank you, Luisa. So do we have our virtual panels? We do. Oh my gosh. These beautiful faces. Oh, I miss all of you. It's so good to see you. We've had the chance to hear from founders who have scaled companies with responsible innovation at the heart from the outset. We just had the chance to hear from founders and how they think about responsible innovation. A critical perspective here is from early stage founders who in particular have I think a distinct set of challenges when it comes to thinking about innovating responsibly. When we talk to founders, we hear a number of, we could call them excuses, maybe more generously we can call them reasons for not engaging in responsible innovation super intentionally. We're already resource constrained. We're still trying to find product market fit. It's too early. What can we realistically do? It's too hard to predict. We sell SaaS software. This doesn't apply to us. And kind of most troublingly, if there were an ethical problem, we would know. Ultimately, we do have agency. And I think as Toyin underscored, and I think Lori on the VC panel thoughtfully underscored, over the course of the medium and the long term, there really is a growing business motivation for thinking about these things from the outset. And so even with the unique constraints that come from being an early stage founder, and I say that as an early stage founder myself. So I am especially excited to introduce some of the most thoughtful founders that we know. First, we have Chapman Snowden, who is the founder and CEO of GoBuild, a company that offers payment solutions to enable small-scale construction companies to scale. That's backed by Tusk Ventures and Precursor and Y Combinator. We have Claire Charal, who's the CEO and co-founder of TopKnot, a company that is making life coaching and personal development affordable for everyone, backed by Homebrew and Backstage Capital and others. And we have Raina Kumra, who is Raina does everything. She is currently the co-founder of Spicewell, which is a superfood and Ayurvedic seasonings company, but also is an advisor at Google X, is a partner at the Fund LA, and is one of the co-creators of arguably the most useful tool for founders getting started on thinking about ethical innovation, the Ethical OS. So with that, hi, it's so good to see all of you. Welcome.
Hello.
I know Chap and Claire are calling in, I think, from the Bay. Ryan calling in from Los Angeles, I believe. And so let's jump right in, because there's a lot to learn from all of you. I know that the way that you've been intentional around these issues, I think, will help other folks realize their agency. So I think when we talk about responsible innovation, right, we often kind of invoke this idea of it being a lens. And Chap, I think maybe we'll start with you here. I've heard you invoke this frame, kind of both directly and indirectly, that responsible innovation and your values it's less about, say, a particular act than it is a lens that diffuses all the decisions that you make as you build your company. So can you speak a little bit to that perspective?
Yeah, so the way that I have found this with my co-founders is that there's sort of stages of how you design this, right? I think the first way in which we think about sort of imbuing ethics into our company is to think about sort of what each of us brings to the table in terms of both strengths and weaknesses, so that we as a sort of like co-founding unit have a good operating system, because if that's not there, then that is the foundation on which everything else will then crumble. But there's a reality, even at small scale, that we can't make every decision, and we can't we can't we can't be the sort of like over the shoulder founders making sure that every decision that every one of our teammates or our customers makes is in line with how we think about this. And there you have to start to think about how do you give your team the really simple tools to, not on the large scale decisions of like, is this an existential question or not, but on the small scale, how do I give a teammate feedback? How do I think about how I design a pattern of interaction on onboarding where they can make a decision comfortably with a framework? And for us, and for me in particular, I have found that using sort of an X over Y, so you can start to talk about things as trade-offs, because it's really easy to say we all value transparency, and then if we're honest with ourselves, there are a number of moments in which we don't value transparency, right? And we make a conscious or subconscious choice to say, I'm not going to be transparent here. And I think for the way that we have built our values at GoBuild is to say, what is the trade-off? Like, when do we feel like we're going to, if transparency is a core value of ours, when do we trade off against that? And what are the most frequent sort of stressors of that, such that we can now say, hey, we trade transparency, or we trade speed for transparency. So we might move slower than some of our competitors, but everybody knows exactly why we made a decision. And so when you give them that framework, what we can do is a decision can be made by myself, my co-founder, someone on our engineering team. We document it, and we can be very clear that this was a decision that was in line with our valuing transparency over speed. Or if we had to make a trade-off and do something that valued speed over transparency, why was that done, right? And that can start to build this sort of data set around, do you have the right values and sort of trade-offs documented, and look at what those trends look like as you go from the discovery phase to the product building phase to sort of scaling your product, and how do those values actually morph over time, because most oftentimes they will.
I love the idea of lens as thinking about values trade-offs, and I want to come back to that in a little bit, to have you double click on specific instances of how that's played out, maybe in terms of product decisions or hiring decisions or decisions that you've made with whether to bring on or not bring on certain customers. I think one of the ultimate trade-offs is that you have to think about as an early stage founder is maybe kind of your values versus like resource accrual. And I know, Claire, you have built your cap table with incredible intention. Can you talk a bit about your motivation and approach for putting in all that work up front to not only have a diverse cap table, but a cap table that was aligned with your values? And maybe can you speak a little bit to how you looked for those signals from investors, how you tested for values alignment, and kind of this far into your journey, maybe how that work up front has possibly paid off?
Yeah. Well, I'm super interested in what Chap just said, because I think the most important decision that we made as a company at the beginning was to clearly align on what our purpose was and our pillars. So our purpose at TopKnot is to move women forward, and our pillars are equity, intentionality, and growth. And if things do not fit in that framework, we just do not do them, because they are fundamentally not TopKnot. And so I want to sit with like, where are our trade-offs? But we do have frameworks underneath each, like a product framework that goes and boils up into these three things. We have an equity framework that we look at all of our decisions through. So like, it sounds like we have a lot of alignment on just like knowing who we are, because you fundamentally need to know who you are in order to build your company. So when it comes to fundraising, I think if there's one takeaway that I give every founder and just how I think about it, fundraising is fundamentally a search task, not a sales task. I'll say it again. It's a search task. You are looking for your people. You will likely not be able to convince somebody who is not looking for you. And so knowing who you are, like, search is a two-way street. It's resonant. Like, you want to be in a meeting where somebody is like, I was wishing that you were going to enter into come through my door, right? Either that they love the thing that they know somebody who needs it, that they themselves need it, that they wanted somebody, in my case, I'm a teacher by trade, so like that they wanted teachers to come and bring their skills to a different arena, whatever the case may be. Like we've all been in that first conversation where you're just vibing, and it can be for a bunch of different reasons, and it doesn't always actually have to look the same way, but you are looking for somebody who is looking for you. And if you are coming into that space authentically, and knowing who you are and knowing like why you exist in the world, then you will find other people who are good people and make sure that your vision grows. So I have so many memorable experiences in building my cap table where I'm like, that person gets it. And then it doesn't become really about like the money or being like, I mean, if they get it, they know the vision and they're excited to be like, they're, you know, jumping in on the rocket ship, like let's all go to space together. So yeah, like our cap table, it's 50% women. Why? Because our company's purpose is to move women forward, and we're going to make a ton of money, and we're going to make it for the women who invested in us. Our cap table is over 20% Black women. Why? Because Black women is a part of our equity mandate. So, you know, if you're going to show up in a way that actually lives out how you want to be in the world, and you're authentic about that, I think other things follow.
Can you talk about kind of this far into your journey, just maybe specific ways in which that being intentional about, I love that search function framing, has bared fruit? Because I mean, the idea that it's a search function still might suggest like there's in some ways can be a bit more work up front. And so in thinking about putting in that work up front, how has it maybe paid dividends at this stage of the company?
Well, I think the way that it's paid dividends is that we have people who are patient and excited and committed to us growing. I would say, yeah, it's more work up front. It's also a willingness to say no. It is being ruthless about where you're putting your time. It's about creating connections with other people who you know have similar values and listening to recommendations from them and spending, for me, I guess, like less time in the Twitterverse chasing after people who are like, I'm going to put up like X amount of money in checks or whatever. Yeah, the intentionality piece, I guess I love serendipity. I don't like randomness. And so if you have a framework you to be open to all the great ways that like excellent people can see you fully and you can share a message with them, great. And when things feel off or random or like you're chasing something that might not actually be like you kind of know that, particularly if you know yourself and you know what you're looking for. So yeah, there's no one on my cap table for whom I'm like nervous to have a hard conversation with. There's nobody on my cap table who I like, you know, wouldn't be absolutely thrilled with what they would do and how they would pay it forward with the money that they made off of Top Knot. So those are like the types of things, like I'm just excited to be working with and alongside people to various degrees. This is not meaning that everybody's like, you know, calling me up every day, asking me about how things are going. But I think that they're fundamentally excited about the impact that we're putting in the world. And they would communicate the work that was happening at Top Knot in a way that would be values aligned. And I would be proud for them to talk about us.
I think the idea of, and the outcome as a founder of not being afraid or having any trepidation about having a difficult conversation with one of your investors is like an incredible outcome to think about, and absolutely seems like, again, one of the fruit from the work that you've put in up front, right? And I think it speaks to this point that Chap was alluding to earlier around trade-offs. And so I think that brings us to Ryan. You know, before starting Spicewell, again, you've been an investor, an operator, an advisor, and I think really notably developed this tool, the Ethical OS, when you were at Omidyar, which is a framework for technologists to understand ethical risk in technology that they're building, anything from algorithmic bias to data control and monetization to bad actors to perpetuating inequity. And so I'm curious if you could maybe speak to the genesis of this tool, and as a founder now and an investor now, how you've seen maybe kind of surfacing ethical risks, doing the work up front of trying to surface ethical risk, maybe kind of can pay dividends down the road for folks building companies.
Yeah, definitely. So the genesis, I think, the kernel of where the ethical OS rose out of was when I had my first startup, and we had raised $7.5 million. We had a pretty good suite of investors, not like Claire, who has, like, it sounds like the best investors ever. And, this was my first rodeo. I hadn't really thought a lot about, having the investors and, giving them a really good ethical rinse before we brought them in. And we had a data leak situation. We had about 5 million records. And it wasn't a leak, but there was a loophole in the Android system that allowed us to see much more than we needed to see as an app about their behavior and what apps they were going to. So, for example, we could see if someone who was married was going on a dating app and at what time and for how long. And when we told our investors about this, it's like, we have to close this loop. We don't need all of this data. They were like, no, absolutely not. You're going to monetize that. That is a competitive advantage. We're going to take this. And so that was one of the moments when I think I first realized that the people who are directing companies are not always the best placed in terms of ethics. And so many years later, when I was at a mid-year network, that's when I started looking at the framework as something just very simple to insert into conversations where there hasn't been a conversation at all about this. And teams don't sit down and, hadn't back then really sat down and thought about their ethical culture. There was a lot of talk about culture, but both what Chapman and Claire said, like, this is a cultural thread that has been missing from the conversation. So that was what my goal and my intention was just, what is the lowest denominator, most simple thing that we can do to at least start the conversation? Because once you start the conversation, then you can actually make progress. But for back then, there was no conversation.
Well, it's such a powerful and important tool, like stemming from this insight that you've had. We've seen in real time countless founders and investors do an exercise with this ethical OS, and they'll see this wheel for the first time, and you'll see the light bulbs go off on, if they're saying they're intentional about ethics and social responsibility, they realize that intentions aren't enough, that they also need rigor behind it.
Yes.
So strongly encourage anyone building a company to check out that tool. It's available for free online. And I think I'd love, so now we've heard a bit about what responsible innovation as early stage founder can look like in cap tables. Talked about this idea of trade-offs. We talked about, Ryan, a specific example of like actual data policy. Chap, I want to bring it back to you, and would love to get into kind of the nitty-gritty of what just operationally kind of instituting some of those like value preferences have looked like, whether it's on the product side or on the process side or on the business model side.
Yeah, before I answer that, I want to go back to one thing that Claire said quickly. I think a lot of founders are aware of sort of like writing this pre-mortem of like, what are the ways, if I'm fast forwarding 2 years, how did my startup die, right? Like, I think it's a scary but sort of like very healthy exercise. I think you can actually drill that down to the investor level as well, especially as you're starting to think about who's going to buy into you. I love that framing of like, this is a search function, not a sales function. And actually start to think about like, what are the types of decisions that will lead to a split with my investor? And then from there, start to think about like, is there a high probability that we will encounter these decisions frequently? Do I not have a high degree of confidence that we can get through them? Because that will help you get away from the, like, it's really great to have all of these name brands on the slide, but actually think about like your success or failure at a fund is oftentimes driven by like the partner and the relationship and the sway that they have. So this is much more of like a search for the partner, not just the function. So sorry, just wanted to say that. But back to your question, I think the best example of this is, we are a fintech company. We are a fintech company that touches the money, which by definition means that we're going to run into fraud. And I will say, prior to about 6 months ago, everybody's view around fintech fraud is that you just keep growing. You try to sort of like make sure that it is not existential levels of fraud that will kill the company, but you grow at all costs. We were fortunate that for the first sort of 9 months of our product and market, we had negligible amounts of fraud, which is also shocking given that we work in small scale construction where we rank second to used car salesmen in the number of financial complaints every year. So like, we knew that this was statistically not likely to continue. And then basically in the span of 6 weeks, we had a massive amount of fraud, so much so that the team and I sat down and said, we have a really clear decision to make. Like, we can continue to grow and we can continue to run this risk, or we can stop and audit everything, all of our customers, our processes, how we're thinking about underwriting. And what we are looking for from a value, how that maps to our values is, transparency. Like, if we're going to continue to fundraise and sort of grow, I need to have a very strong understanding of, is this emblematic of our business model, of our process, of our market, like how to start to model this risk on a go forward basis. And, that transparency was going to come at the cost of growth, which, we had been growing at somewhere between 25 and 30% month over month. So like, we were on a path, and that's a hard path to get off, because once you stop that, like, rebooting that is not as simple as just turning the product back on, especially if you make fundamental changes to the product. And so we talked as a team. The team decided that we needed to pause growth, and what ended up being basically 2 months. And this was a great time to test the relationship with our investors, because at that point we said, we think that this is the right choice given where we are. Most of our investors agreed. A lot of them sort of like went through the thoughtful exercise of like, okay, if you were to grow, like if you were to sort of ignore this and continue to grow, what would that mean for your debt facilities, all of this? And while I think there was really healthy pushback, at the end of the day, no one said this was the wrong decision, and no one really sort of like stepped away from us. And I think that was a really practical example of us making sure that us sort of reaffirming that we had made the right choices around both our investor base and also the call for what we thought was healthy for the company.
Can I add?
Go ahead, Claire. Please go ahead.
We have our own example of this. So we touch less fraud, but in thinking about growth and equity, we were actually post-revenue on a product that had a really fervent user base. But that user base was largely college educated, because the way that the product worked required people to have some familiarity with academic discussion. And it was also, it was like 3 or 4 people in a room at the same time, which was like inherently performative, which also created these like sort of status within. Anyway, it was a cool product, but it wasn't the product that was going to let us live out our intention to bring access to this coaching adjacent work to the world. It just wasn't. It required too many modalities that like only some people have the privilege of existing in, or having like a bunch of practice using. And so we scrapped it, which was scary. And in some ways, making that decision was a test also of our investors, because now we had to like raise a little mini bridge to keep us alive for a little bit longer. And people came back in, which is, there is no thank you note. But it was ultimately the right decision for us to be who we are. And the new product's amazing. Like, come hang out on Top Knot with us. But it was absolutely the right decision, but it goes back to, we started to stray away from one of these core pillars who made us who we are. And ultimately, I think I'll look back and be like, this is one of my proudest moments about Top Knot, but it's also really, it's a hard conversation to have where you're like, we're growing and people love it. Like, those are the two things that you're used to saying, like, these are good things. And you're like, yeah, but these aren't good for the way we've conceptualized ourselves. Tough, but right.
I think in this moment, hearing two examples of venture-backed founders making the very intentional decision to pause growth when they could have steamrolled through it is incredibly powerful. And it makes me curious. I mean, you both alluded to, I know you've both alluded to, and I know both Top Knot and Go Build had very intentional and deliberate sessions at the outset to build value pillars or value kind of trade-off pillars. And I'm curious, Ryan, about your experience now, like kind of building this new company. What do you feel like are the either like first of all, oh, by the way, gorgeous new website. It's beautiful. Everyone check out the Spicewell website. But what do you feel like are the maybe most important guardrails or cultural or structural pillars that you're building that you feel like will be able to set you up to be a values-driven company and make hard decisions like those potentially down the line?
Yeah, it's really ironic because, I used to work in advertising and I left advertising because I was, I found a problem with my soul just selling things all day. And then, I moved into technology and advocacy and talking about technology ethics and data privacy and all of these things. And so with all those different hats on, and then I found myself in the seat of someone who has to sell all day again, utilizing all of these tools that continually misuse data. So it's been a very humbling experience, and practically speaking, it is something that I had to give a lot of thought about, just with where I've come from and what I know about data practices. But it was very informed. And I think, that like I wrote our privacy policy. I did not copy paste one. I wrote it by hand. And that was a great exercise. That is something I recommend everyone do. Do not just take the boilerplate and copy paste it, because that is sort of your first stake in the ground about what you will do and what you will not do. And it also shows that you have close control over those decisions.
I think the idea of, again, we hear, is it too early? And the idea of having a privacy policy, even as, is it a pre-seed, seed at this point?
Yeah, pre-seed. We just opened a node, yeah.
As a pre-seed company is really powerful. It isn't too early. And if you use, again, kind of a tool like Ethical OS or a tool that Rachel Gillum had alluded to in the opening keynote, consequence scanning, or a handful of other frameworks that actually we'll share in the hop-in and after the conference, you can actually have kind of meaningful insight into how you can surface some of these risks even at the pre-seed stage. I want to open it up to questions in just a bit. But first, I guess, and maybe this is for all of you, kind of a two-sided question. So just I guess in the first place, what do you wish you had known, or what advice would you have for early stage founders who want to be, I guess we can call it values driven. I know we kind of have a nomenclature challenge here, especially because I feel like in each of your instances, you're not social impact companies per se, right? But impact is important to you. And we heard that in the VC, like both I think in the VC panel and in the conversation with Toyin and Rachel, there's this kind of increasingly blurry line between kind of non-impact and responsible, and also social impact, and where one sits it's kind of difficult. But if what do you wish you had known, or what do you wish you had built, or what advice would you give to kind of founders building for the first time that kind of want to be intentional in this way someplace on this spectrum. And I'll just open it up to whoever wants to respond first.
I'll take the advice route, and then I'll sit with what regrets I have in a minute.
Regrets are good. We can do regrets. Yeah.
Well, my advice would be, in order to set company values, I think that you have to have awareness of your personal values and then the values of your co-founding or early team. So my advice would be, and this is unsurprising given the line of work I do, but get a coach. It's a really incredible investment at the beginning and understanding who you are and how you show up in times of stress, and how you want to move forward with the people around you. So yeah, my co-founder and I started coaching. So we actually get coached together, which is cute. And we had our first session on the first day that we started our company. We had known each other for 6 years prior. It is the thing that allows us to constantly come back and check in sort of like a judgment-free space of where we are, and how we're moving forward. So, I mean, this all bubbles up to just a general awareness of like who you want to be and how you want to show up in this work. Because there are easier things to do. But getting support in order to do that, super helpful.
I love that, and I don't want to trivialize it. Like the idea of, and we've heard this, I think, actually at each point in the conference so far, this idea of introspection, as being important. It speaks to the Toni Morrison quote that we led with, the preamble to problem solving. I think a lot of us maybe come from technical backgrounds and we get excited and eager about problems, and we do that before necessarily being grounded in our own values and thinking about the types of outcomes that we want to have over the long run. So thanks for that, Claire. Anyone else want to hop in on one of those?
Yeah, I was, I think this is an extension of what Claire said, but just to be like, I think very frank about it, like building startups are hard, and they're like, I think you could argue that they're like fundamentally illogical. But trying to I think the thing to recognize in that is that the path of least resistance in startups is actually not to be ethical. It's not to put this amount of thought into it. And so every little decision that you encounter is going to require that much more work to do it in a way that we are all trying to do. And that it's what I want to emphasize is that beyond that sort of very nice little soundbite that sounds great on a panel like this, the reality is that the fatigue from that constant decision making is almost indescribable. And so I think my two pieces.
I'll give you a hug, man.
I mean, yeah, I will welcome a hug. Thank you. But I think my two pieces of advice around that are to before you get into that, be aware of that. You can't predict how much it's going to affect you, but I think you have to be okay with it. And then the second part is have something in your life. It can be a person, it can be an activity, there needs to be a space in which you can recharge, you can vent, you can have introspection. It could be coaching, it could be meditation. I'm not going to be prescriptive and tell you what it is, but I know that you need to carve out a non-trivial amount of time in order to be able to have the energy to come back and sort of deal with the implications of these decisions on what feel like a very minute basis.
Community and support like this,
yes.
Hopefully as an angle.
Yes.
Thanks for that, Chad. Rhonda, did you want to?
I'm just going to underline both what Chapman and Claire had said. And I think as solo founder, I will say build an advisory board before you think you need one, because those are going to be your temporary co-founders, or get a co-founder, and make sure that you have someone who is a good sounding board at all times, because otherwise you're just talking to yourself, and that is a little bit crazy making.
So I think those responses again kind of speak to this duality that we have to acknowledge, where especially as an early stage founder, there are thousands of organizational design decisions that you're making virtually every day. And Chap, to your point, thinking through them on kind of an ethical basis adds this potentially additional weight, additional friction, additional time. And so on the one hand, we're maybe acknowledging that in a number of contexts it costs more upfront, but then to hear stories like Claire's where you're in a situation where you need a bridge round or have a hard conversation with an investor, or even hear about kind of the outcomes that Toyin was speaking to. And it does seem like on the other side of this, there can be flywheels, right? And so it does feel like both are true at the same time. And I guess to that point, we have a question from online. I think folks want to kind of double click into what, again, kind of what this might look like structurally. We talk about kind of these thousands of organizational design decisions from, incentive structures to, product decisions. Does anyone have any specific examples of either core incentives that you've set up on your team or additional kind of product decisions or organizational design decisions that kind of speak to your values or some of these trade-offs?
Yeah, we've been an entirely remote team. I think the largest we were just about 20 people. We carved out time on a bi-weekly basis to do what we call just like reflection time, and we truly opened it up to everybody on the team and we would use different formats. It could be like a start, stop, continue. It could be a reflection on what the past product sprint has been doing, but we empowered really everybody to sort of be a active participant, commentator, and critiquer of everything from how myself and my co-founder were leading at that moment to how a process was going, and opening up that sort of like organizational mirror on a very consistent basis, not just a monthly all hands, not just sort of a survey you send out over Slack, like actually sort of builds this organizational muscle for people to be able to figure out how to question things productively and in a way that can sort of push a decision forward. And I think you need to do that when things are going well, because if you don't have that organizational fluency when things aren't going well, everything breaks.
So build infrastructure when things are good. That's especially important. Yeah.
I heard Raina say something about an advisory board. I think we did really good work at the beginning. The advisory board is interesting because you can call on your people to support you. And you can also evaluate where you're myopic and bring people in. So my co-founder and I were both white women. There are certain, we just needed more people and more perspectives. And so we brought in largely actually really good friends of ours who are all just incredible at whatever area they were in to make up this holistic team. And then I would say something that I had the thought of, which actually ended up being brilliant, was creating a separate text message number, like a Google Voice number, so that I could split when I was talking to them as Claire, the friend, and Claire looking for capacity as an advisor. Which was great because I think oftentimes, we think about the drain on the personal relationship potentially for bringing somebody in, or we're asking too much. The other thing is we gave them all equity. These were, and we actually gave them fully vested equity grants up front because it was an acknowledgement of the fact that they had been our people and that they were saying yes when so much of this was unclear. I think our lawyer was like, what? But it was a communication of just how important, them saying yes to the idea of hopping on board. And these people are VP of people at big tech companies or DEI experts, or but also happen to be people who I regularly grab dinner with, or and so having that split and just actually having a different phone number to say, I'm not coming to you as somebody who also wants to go out and get dinner on Saturday was such a big move.
So I think the idea of acknowledging your own blind spots and especially looking for support in those areas, particularly kind of at an ethical front, is powerful. Ethical advisor, or an advisory board as sort of a tactical strategy for having insight into your own blind spots feels valuable. Relatedly, we have a question from online. Just folks are wondering if there are specific resources that any of you kind of turn to for guidance. We mentioned the ethical OS, we mentioned consequence scanning, but are there roadmaps, reports, any resources that you found valuable?
I'm going to pitch my course because I know that it has impacted a lot, and Lyle, you know with your students as well. So I can put the link in the chat.
Yeah, pitch it. Yeah, and we'll put it on the hop end too.
Yeah, and so with the work that I do for my corporate clients, they often need the 101. So sometimes you just have to start at the beginning, and then for the more advanced, and a lot of equity and DEI work is already built into this, and so there is some fluency and dialogue already with some of that. But I think the base is, how do we build a culture where we are constantly thinking about who is not in the room, and how do we build empathy in people who may not feel like empathy is part of their job. And I think those are just two sort of core practices that I have put in place in larger organizations. And I've also worked with startups on doing, like Chapman said, before the big inflection point, because when you're running and you're operating and you're growing, you don't have time to think about this. So like literally your structure as a company, your culture as a company begins with two people, the first two people.
I love that distillation of going from blind spots to expressly thinking about who isn't in the room when you're making decisions and trying to fill that blind spot. So we have time for maybe one quick kind of lightning round of questions, and this comes in part from online. I'm curious, and we'll go around. Can you talk about a time where you were especially proud of your company, and maybe bring it back to kind of a specific structural or organizational or cultural decision that you made that helped drive that outcome? And whoever wants to start can just hop on.
Yeah, we went through a period where we grew pretty significantly about a year ago. And, I think one of the things that tests in growth, you test how well you've instantiated your values in your team, because you start to see patterns of behavior that are going to change, and you have to sort of make a call. It's like, is that a natural growth of what happens when you add people, or is this a fundamental change in how we our core sort of operating system? Earlier this year, we had made a hire that, through a series of actions, sort of exhibited some behavior that was not congruent with the core culture that we wanted to build. And that can be very contentious in a virtual environment, right? It's hard to figure out sort of who takes the lead here and how to address this. And I was particularly proud of 4 or 5 folks on my team who this person didn't report into, but they identified this behavior, sat this person down, had a conversation about how this wasn't in sort of the vein of what the culture we're building at GoBuild, and really frame this as this isn't us. If this isn't the way that you want to participate in a company, that is completely fine. And let's build sort of a graceful exit ramp for you. And that was done in large part absent from the founding team, done a lot on their own and sort of surfaced to us through that. And that was a really good example of the core values that you build in your team, sort of expressing themselves in a really healthy, positive way that allowed somebody to exit with grace, rather than being sort of a very sort of exit filled with turmoil.
Love that. Thank you, Chad. Claire, Raina, we have 2 minutes, 1 minute. So just quick, any quick thoughts from either of you? Sorry.
I think I shared mine with the product pivot, but I would organically at the end of every Top Knot Time session because you're broken out in a one-on-one conversation. I don't get to see all those conversations. I only participate in one. But frequently in the chat at the end, people like share the impact of whatever their conversation was, and just to have people like say that they felt so listened to and heard and they have clarity and what, like, I actually just want to like save every chat and just like shoot it into my veins, right? Because it's working. We made the right decision. So
awesome. Rana, do you?
Yeah. Well, every time I get a product review or I hear from someone who used Spicewell and they're like, we have changed our salt and pepper completely. We are now only using this Ayurvedic one. We're only using your high vitamin, nutrient dense salt and pepper. I'm like, okay, yes, we have one more person who is getting more nutrition, and we're fighting big food and the terrible things that have the food industry has done to this country and to our bodies. And so that always feels like a little win. On the bigger side, I think just anytime I see someone who's taken the course, I feel so good. And then I also get feedback about how it's changed the way they think. And I super proud of that work.
Cosign taking the course. The thing I love about each of those examples, and this will wrap us up, is I think they each speak to this idea of, I mean, culture is the way people behave when you're not in the room, right? And that's the thing that scales. And so all the work, all the intention, that all the extra friction that you put in up front is that's the thing that spreads as you grow. And I feel like you can draw a direct line between each of the things that you've said you're most proud of, with the fact that each of you have been so intentional at the outset. And I think that underscores one of the essential points here that we're trying to make, which is, as difficult as it is to be an early stage founder, we do have agency. And I think all of you have demonstrated that in really inspiring ways. So thank you so much for joining us. A round of applause for.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
thank you so much.
And now we'll send it back to Jema in San Francisco.